Hi, and welcome to Homoludens, the show on history and board games. Tonight, we're discovering a game recently added to the P500 of GMT, Borikén, with its designer, Julio Nazario. As usual, please feel free to ask your question in the chat, and I will bring them up to Julio so he can answer them. And if you see that I'm not bringing them instantly, don't worry. I have a sort of structure to that discussion, so it might be more relevant for me to bring it up at another point in the discussion. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And before we start, I also would like to thank my backers on Coffee for their support, making sure that this show is in glorious 180p. So thanks to them. And I can see that there are already a couple of people in the chat. So I want to say hi to everyone. Hi to Eric. Hi to Gordo. Hi to Pierre. And I'm going to bring in Julio Nazario to the stream. Hey, Julio. Thanks for joining us tonight. Oh, you're muted. That's a normal accident that often happens. Can you? Yeah, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Hello, Fred. Thank you for having me.
Man, I'm very happy to have you. Thanks for taking the time to talk about this really exciting game, a very unique topic. And people that are usuals of the show know that I like when a game designer or trying to bring different perspective and address different events in wargaming or historical gaming in general. So super excited to have you here tonight. But before we start talking about the game, and I know that people want to see the game and everything, but I like to start things differently. Maybe you could start by introducing yourself, what you do aside of this design project, what you do in life, but also uh, we'll talk also maybe a bit later about your relationship with gaming. But first, a bit more about you.
Yes, for sure. So my name is Julio Nazario. I am currently living in North Carolina in the U.S. Originally from Ponce, Puerto Rico, which is Borikén, as we're calling it in the game. I lived there for the first 24 years of my life until I moved into the U.S. I have been designing for about 5 years now. I'm the designer of Holy Festival of Colors, Control, and I got Dulce from Stronghold Games. I got a couple of games out, including Borikén.
But that's great. So you already have quite a bit of a career as a game designer. So some pretty big games, more for maybe a bit more general audience, because GMT is more of a
Specialized.
it's more specialized. Even if it's a big publisher, probably the biggest in the more gaming world, but pretty open. Is this your main job, or do you do other things outside?
Yeah, it is not. It is not. I work as a civil engineer for roads on the National Forest in North Carolina. That is my main job, working with the design and maintenance of roads in national forests.
So it's also kind of design in a way. So it's so there. Do you see connections between the two, between your daily job and your job as a or your occupation as a game designer?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing that I never thought saw myself as even until recently was being creative. I can't clap and sing at the same time. I can barely draw doodle pictures, and I never saw myself as very creative until I started designing games. And essentially, once I started playing board games and delving into the hobby, is when I decided to also start designing them, and it came together pretty quickly and designed a lot of games in the meantime, and it's been a whole lot of fun.
It's interesting what you're saying about creativity, because I really feel like often people don't expect themselves to be creative, and sometimes they do some pretty creative stuff without realizing it. I'm thinking about people, for example, that are coding. I think it's one of the example. I think coding can be
Yeah.
extremely creative, and some often like IT engineers or stuff like this are thinking, well, I'm not a creative person. It's like, yeah, well, you had pretty creative approach to solve problems, and it's actually creativity is in can be unsuspected in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the whole thing of problem solving is instrumental in being an engineer and being a designer. In this case, we're solving problems for fun engines, right? And trying to make sure that those are figured out and people are enjoying that whole process of experiencing your game.
And can you tell us a bit more about the previous game that you designed before?
Yes. So my first games came out in 2020. So not the best time for games to come out. but it is what it is. And essentially, my games have been mainly fairly abstract in a sense, but they have involved a lot of verticality as part of the mechanisms of gameplay of games. If you don't know, Holy and both Control as well, they use three-dimensional aspects to their gameplay. Holy has a three-layered board, kind of like a 3D chess, and is an area control game where you're essentially placing, and if they're not supported, they fall to lower levels. And Control is a pure abstract game where you have a cube and you're doing an area control around a cube and looking at it from the different directional perspectives of that cube to be able to score it at the end of the game. So I wanted always as a designer to just implement three dimensionality, not just as a visual, but also as a gameplay interaction.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting because I was about to say that usually the third dimension in gaming, especially in the era of Kickstarter, is mostly used for purely aesthetics reason. It's for minifigs, and people who know the show know that I hate plastic figurines. And I think that the use of the third dimension is always a bit not super creative, and it is very rare that designers and publisher think of a third dimension in the gameplay. And when it happens, usually it can create some pretty interesting results. Why do you think it's the case that the third dimension is not that much used in board games?
I think it has to do with, once you incorporate a three dimensionality to it, people expect more of a toy factor in games. And that does bring in the whole, okay, what's the genre that I'm trying to get into with the game that I'm designing? And you can tell that with a game that has any sort of toy factor is definitely family or kid genre of games. And then I think it also has to do with the amount of brain space that you're using when you're playing the game, right? When you involve a third dimension into your thinking process, not everybody is good with that kind of analysis, and that's completely fine. But that does mean that the more brain power you use to kind of analyze this simple game that can be abstract takes away from other mechanisms that you can incorporate into the game. That's why you probably don't see a lot of that in heavier games. You've got some exceptions like Sulkin and stuff like that where they have these, the gears and that turn around, and that adds to the brain burniness to it. But it's in its base, it is a fairly simple game.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's true that spatial complexity increases exponentially as soon as you add a dimension. Obviously, that's a really interesting point. But then more about yourself and your relationship with games. What got you into games and like into games first, but then what motivated you to start making those games?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I moved to the U.S. about 7 years ago, and I've always been a big extrovert. I love playing with people, like video games mainly. And when I moved to the U.S., I didn't have many people to hang out with, and I decided to see what was around. And I saw there was this board game store. I went and I just saw all these different games and just started learning about them. And there was actually a local game convention like the next weekend, and I played, the whole Catan and Ticket to Ride and so many other games that you usually just get introduced with little by little. But in a weekend, I played a lot of them, and from then on, I started playing a game competitively called Dice Masters. And in that game, I in the first year, I went to the world's competition. I got seventh place, and after that, by that time, I was already meddling into design, and that came into fruition from my engineering design work. I was with a coworker, and again, I work for the National Forest. So, and he was talking about all these different types of trees, as in yellow pine, white oak, black walnut, red maple, and I just connected these trees having colors with them, and I said, "There's probably a game in here somewhere." And that's how my first design came to be, which it was never published, but it was called Timber Tactics, and that's how it all started.
I love the title, Timber Tactics. I actually I would play a game called Timber Tactics, but we'll see. Maybe you will put it back from the cupboard and revisit it and make a new game with your now experienced designer skills. That would be that could be really fun. But then, so you're talking a lot about maybe a bit more abstract game or more general board game that are a bit more classic. Even if you're a pro player in Dice Meister, I didn't expect that. I think that's pretty funny, and that's pretty awesome. But I'm wondering on the side, did you in that journey of discovering games, did you play any historical games or war games in that process, or that was a part of the hobby that you didn't really engage with?
To be honest, no, I did not. So one of the reasons why a lot of my games have to do with more of a general audience is that whole connection of me being Hispanic. So Spanish is my main language, and of course, English is one that I speak as well. And I've always liked the idea of games being language independent, and there's a lot of those that have done extremely well. And just I'm trying to reach as much of an audience because I want people like myself that can understand a game without having to read through the rules a lot. You get an explanation and you get right into playing the game. Now, as I grew as a designer, I always meddled into different genres of design, and historical board games is one that, while I didn't really play a lot, I always thought that it was a good opportunity to design a game in that genre, because as a designer, I didn't want to limit myself to just a specific type of game to be designing, and I thought that it would just be a great way to grow as a designer.
That's really, yeah, and that's it's really interesting what you're saying around language dependence, because I think that a lot of people in wargaming, especially when they are from an English speaking country, don't realize how hard it can be to get into those games. And we have, for example, the same problem in France. Those games are pretty heavy. It requires a lot of concentration and effort to understand the rules, and when it's not in your language, it's a pretty high barrier of entry that you have here. And it's not just an easy game to get to the table. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Since you worked on Borikén, did you start playing a bit of historical games, a tiny bit, and start to go a bit in that direction, or not?
And again, to be honest, I have not, mainly because when I started working on this game, it was mid-pandemic, right? And
Mm.
even we're talking about last year, and a lot of the things that this came up was 2020 for me was a year of growing. I learned tabletop simulator as a tool. I got myself a 3D printer. I knew how to use Nandeck, which is a card creation tool, and I thought that all those tools were great to use as a designer. And 2021 for me is definitely a year of changes. My son was born in January of 2021, my firstborn, and I don't know if you have kids, but kids take a lot of time, and I did not have a lot of time to design games as much. And at that time, and we'll probably get into this more, but the Zenobia Award was just releasing, and I thought it was just a great
Mm.
opportunity to delve into this genre that I've always wanted to design in, and they would give me a base tool set and even mentors and people that would help me along the process that were more experienced than I was, and were into the hobby, that part of the hobby as well.
So first of all, congratulations for the firstborn,
Thank you.
and I hope you managed to get some sleep. So that would be nice. But you already started mentioning the Zenobia and everything, and I think it's a good time for us to transition into the section of the discussion around Borikén, specifically this design. Maybe the question I would like to start with, which I always think is an interesting question before talking about the game itself, but more around the motivation. What motivated you to make this specific game?
Yes, for Borikén, as I said earlier, Borikén is the native name for Puerto Rico, which is an island that's currently a Commonwealth as we call it here, but it is essentially a modern day colony of the United States. And this is based on the native Taíno Indian of that island, right as the Spanish were arriving to the new world that is the Americas. And as a Puerto Rican, it's interesting because you always were taught that um, our race is made out of three different base races, being Spanish, Taino, Indian, and African. And you can definitely see that in what is our Puerto Rican people as a whole, because you can never tell how, but just by looking at a person if they're Puerto Rican or not, because we're just all over the place visually. um, and and as I moved to the U.S. and started working with the Forest Service, I noticed the whole importance of preserving the natural and archaeological histories of the native people of the U.S. And that is something that I was introduced to in Puerto Rico, but it was different because there weren't people that were straight descendants from the Taíno Indians. Um, and I thought that there was a story to be told there, especially because in our island, the Spanish, in a sense, are seen as a great people that just brought the island into new world kind of thing. And there's definitely another point of perspective to be told here. Essentially, as a from a historical perspective, you can see that the history was told from Victoria's point of view, the victory point of view. And there is another side of this story to be told. And me doing the research involving that is kind of what came to. I wanted to design a game about it, and I wanted to tell more about this story that not a lot of people uh, maybe they know, and they just don't consider it as much.
I think it's a great motivation for a game, that commemorative value that gaming can bring about remembering things that are maybe not as much represented in more general or history. So I think that's a really interesting motivation. You mentioned the Zenobia Awards because you actually designed that project within that process, and I wanted to maybe start for our viewers that might not have heard about the Zenobia Awards. Could you present the initiative just in a few words?
Yes, yes. The Zenobia Award is essentially a group of people that have come together from the wargaming historical games industry, and try to bring voices up that are from underrepresented cultures. And the first Zenobia Award, which was in 2021, we had about 150 submissions of people from underrepresented cultures designing games in the historical games genre. And from there on, games went into being semifinalists, and I was in those semifinalists, and then finalists, and ultimately a winner. And it was interesting because bringing in people from outside the historical gaming area brought, in a sense, a fresh take on what a historical game can be. And I thought that was a great thing because of it. And not just that, they also, each one of those people that were in the Zenobia Award had a mentor that was a designer of some sort of historical game that you were in designing the game, and that person would give you feedback throughout the whole process. And for me, that was Ivan Cáceres. And it was a great opportunity to just go through that, because again, trying to design a game for an audience that you don't know, especially if you don't play the kind of historical games that I'm talking about, right? It was definitely a point that I did not want to cross, because I wanted to know about the audience before I designed a game that would cater to them.
That's super interesting. So for those watching that don't know who Ivan Caceres he is, he's a war game designer, but even more impressively, a superb board game artist, or artist in general. He made a game called Santa Cruz 1797.
There you
Really excellent game, block game. So if you're watching this and you want to uh, you have extra income, you can buy this game. So I would recommend
go.
this. What did this relationship with Yvan brought to you in your design process?
Well, it was interesting because I was starting from scratch, right? And I've been used to designing games in a sense of, okay, I have an idea and I'm just gonna try and bring it to the table and test it and see what happens there. But for this one, that wasn't the case. I knew, especially with the historical base that it was based off, that I had to do a lot of research to get there. And of course, one thing Ivan did that was very useful was that I had a huge scope of what the game was going to be, right? And as the Zenobia Award went on, he was like, well, you got to make sure to focus on the things that you want the game to represent, and not just try to get everything into one thing, and then it's just going to be like a spaghetti in a sense. And he was a good person to have me keep on direction of what my objective was. And if it wasn't for him, the project wouldn't have come into fruition, because I was just trying to make it perfect, and that wasn't never going to be the case.
But so, and you're touching upon something that I think is super interesting. So you had that general intention that motivated you to make the game in the first place, and then through the discussion with Ivan, you decided to focus on what you really wanted to do, your core objective. Could you explain what is the objective of the design as it is today? When you reached that focus, what did you want it to show?
So I wanted to have the player experience what the Taíno went through in those times. And one thing that came together fairly quickly was the fact that I wanted to do it into different stages, because in a short amount of time, we're say in this case 40 years, they went from, being a people of an island that were just recently recovering from internal conflict, to having this new people introduced that were much more advanced. They thought of them as gods, and then ultimately finding out that they're not gods and going into war with them, and winning a few battles here and there, but ultimately losing, and having to escape the island to survive as little as they can, because not just because of the war conflict, but also diseases that came, and the encomienda system, and bringing their religious beliefs into it all. So I thought that was a interesting point of switching perspectives of, okay, there's internal conflict, and that's pre 1493, and then there's the introduction of the Spanish, 1493 to 1511, and then the survival aspect of trying to, you're gonna lose the island, and you're losing people, so you got to make sure to do anything to survive.
Okay, so that's really interesting, and actually, it might answer one question that we had from Pierre here that was asking regarding your game. So your game is revolving around three scenarios or three phases. So are each of the scenarios meant to tell different part of the story? And obviously, it does, as you just said. But then my question to build up upon the one that Pierre just asked is: can you play each scenario independently, or how does it work?
You sure can. Yes, each scenario can play independently, which is starting setup of the game, or if you want, you can play them all in a continuous play. But yeah, each scenario is essentially uses the same gameplay, but some mechanisms and interactions change. Of course, one of them, the big ones being the first scenario, is competitive. There's no Spanish because they hadn't arrived yet. And then the second and third scenario are cooperative. And that one, you are working together against a common foe.
And no player takes the faction of the Spanish, so the players are only placed in the position of playing the Taino people, right?
Yes, sir.
Good. And do you think that was important for the intention that you had to what you wanted to show?
Yes, because the Spanish people, the perspective is one that is widely known, and a lot of people know about it, even if it's not the correct history in a sense, or I guess the popular history, what I would say. And in this case, I wanted to bring in the Taino perspective because it's one that exists, and there's history behind it, but not a lot of people know it. And obviously it is one that it has not a happy ending, right? And it is important that people learn about these of our history, and this is obviously as a historical person yourself, those who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. And this is a perspective that I definitely wanted to be known.
Great. That's I think that puts a bit of context, and we'll go back to your process around research and everything. But I think now we know enough, and I would say maybe we should jump into the game so you can give us a bit of an overview of what the game looks like. So just a note. Those are prototype components. It's not final art, so I don't want to see comment about like doesn't matter. It's like we're looking at the mechanics and how the game plays. I'm going to bring in, so we are using TTS. As you were saying that during the pandemic you learned how to use TTS, and we can see the result of that. You're using custom textures for tables and everything. Really impressive. So, that's really nice. So can you give us a bit of an overview of how your game plays?
Yes, for sure. So Borikén is essentially an area control game. And here you see the map of current day Puerto Rico, but it's divided into the Cacicados, which is kind of like the Taíno villages and different locations. And so you see that we've got the west, north, east, central, and south, and each of them are essentially the main points of interest in the game, and they're the locations that you're trying to, in the first version of the game where you're doing cooperative, you're trying to discover parts of the island and getting control of those locations as a cacique leader, which is the who you're representing. And on the other ones, you're trying
And
to, yes.
just to clarify, because there is a question here, and you just answered that, but just to make it clear, so each player is playing a specific cacique leader that will, yeah.
Yes, yes, and we have a deck of 10 cacique leaders that you can either choose based on their their background history, or just randomly choose one, and that's what you get. Now, of course, based on what you get a special asymmetric rule representative of that cacique leader.
Great.
So yeah, essentially, like I said, is an area control game that you are trying to either control parts of the island or regain control as you lose it from the Spanish. And essentially, the way the interaction of the game works is that you use what I call the cacique board. And the game is essentially one where you take this pawn. Well, I guess there's one here, and you choose one of the three different representations of what the cacique was for their village. And they were both a political leader, a military leader, and a religious leader. So you would take this pawn here, and you would choose one of the three, and you would do the actions that these are base actions that are on top, and you would do those actions based on which one you choose. Of course, as the game goes, you can actually strengthen those actions by adding different Taínos, which is one of the main resources in the game is your people, right? So each Taíno has a representation that's based off the color of the island that they come from. So you see the different colors, and also the affinity that they can belong to. In this case, this is the religious one. This is the political one, and this is the religious one. So you can, in the future, you can get resources. Which one of the resources that you use in this game, obviously, is gold. And you can add more actions to this board when you play it. And based on what you do, you once you do an action, you start using the actions as they go. So in this one, you can do movement, and movement is that you have a representation on the board, and you can move along the board to do the different actions. And like I said, one of the main things in this game is you've got the different resources that you're fighting over. One of them being the cassava, which is one of the main food resources at the time, and of course, gold. And gold is an interesting mechanism that we have here because it's a little bag that has 15 tokens of gold and 15 rocks. And you essentially, when you're mining gold, which is one of the actions, and you need to be in a mine to do that, you take a specific amount of gold based on what's on top. And this track right here is for the third game, but this is one of the main mechanisms that changes between the three games. The track in the second game dictates how much gold you can gain when you mine, because gold is used to essentially push away the Spanish. It's a way to get rid of them without having to fight. But the more gold you use, the more Spanish come later in the game.
Mm.
Uh, so of course, when you do that, it kind of has that little random element of, okay, I'm gonna get 4 tokens. Okay, I got a rock and 2 rocks and a gold. So that's essentially it's pretty straightforward, but it works. And of course, that's being one of the resources that you use in this game to fight against the enemy in this case. And what's interesting about the second one is that you are going through the historical events that happen during those times, which is kind of the introduction of the Spanish and the encomienda system, and the different battles that happened in that time, especially in the 1510 and 1511. And you're trying to accomplish those objectives before you lose control of the island. So losing control of the island means that there's more Spanish than Taíno on all sections of the island. So once you do that, you lose. How do you incorporate the Spanish? And as I said earlier, one of the things that I like to do in my games is language independence. So you don't see a lot of text here besides just maybe what the actions do. But one of the things that I incorporated just to introduce that historical context in the mechanisms is something as simple as this. This is the enemy deck. The enemy deck, you essentially flip it at the start of the turn, and that adds Conquistador in that location. Now, you as your active turn, it says, okay, if you use the religious action, this is what happens. If you use the military action, this is what happens. So there's a positive and a negative one, and then there's a neutral one. So if you're planning on what you want to do, this may affect your decision here. So of course, it is one thing. Okay, you see military Spanish ships obviously being introduced into the island was something that they couldn't have as easy movement throughout the island because of their presence there. And of course, the Taíno having their religious beliefs and their gods is something that is incorporated because this is their perspective, right? And then you've got stuff like roads. Road is something that were introduced when the Spanish came, which is a positive because it was easier to get to different places. And of course, the greed that came of it being a negative thing on when it came to the gold. So you can see these little things, they're all historical in a sense, but it's not a big paragraph that you're just reading and that's it. This is something that affects you in the game.
And how would you rank the complexity of your game? Because you said that it's you're trying to limit the language dependency, but it doesn't mean that the game is simple. So I'm just wondering how.
It definitely isn't. It definitely isn't. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say this is about a 3-4.
Yeah.
So it is fairly straightforward in a sense, but the interactions that happen between players and between the game system is what makes it interesting. And of course, having some of the engine building elements and the strategy to control the island and not lose control and just cooperate to make sure that things happen a certain way. And when different historical characters are introduced that affect the way you play the game, which makes it so even though you're playing 3 different scenarios, right, not every scenario is going to be the same for everybody because there's a lot of different elements that can be introduced based on existing pre-existing scenarios or just the setup introduction at the start of the game if that's the only one that you're playing. But every game essentially lasts for about 45 minutes to an hour and a half. So that tells you that you're going throughout all this, but it doesn't take a lot of time either.
Okay. And so that's 45 minutes to an hour and a half for each of the scenarios.
Yes, sir.
And does it mean that what happens so when you play a campaign, so each scenario is going to inform what's going to happen next? So you have a bit of this campaign feel, I guess, right?
Yes, that is the plan. So one of them being, especially if when you finish the first scenario, which is competitive, right? That one could dictate essentially who's going to be the Aguaybana character. That's that was essentially the high Cacique of the land. And this one just essentially gives you, in a sense of, okay, you can use other players' tokens to do your actions, which is something that because he was the one that was the one essentially that who was over all of them. So it is interesting because in that sense, it is a player power, but it is an important one and one that will change as the game goes on because this Cacique dies and another one is introduced that is fairly different as well. But of course, another thing, and this is something that we are working on, is the introduction of both Taíno characters and Spanish characters, depending on the locations that were taken over by the end of the game on the different scenarios. So of course, that's going to affect how the gameplay is going to look in the next game.
And there is a question here from Patchwork Pictures asking how does the turn sequence work? Is it simultaneous action selection or is there a variable first player? Just to get a bit of an idea of how is the round structure.
Yeah, it's not simultaneous selection. Is essentially, it's just a turn sequence, right? So you on your turn, you go by taking this pawn and putting it on one of the other two. So whatever you choose now, you can't choose on the next turn, right? Once you perform your actions, then it's the next player's turn.
Hmm.
So that is essentially this turn sequence. So the game is 2 to 4 players in that sense. So it really, because of the way the actions work, and you have limited action, and of course you can use your Taíno cards and discard them to do, one-time actions, but they're gone. And one of the losing conditions on the second game is that if you go through the whole Taíno deck, that means that you lose all your people and you lose. So the turns go fairly quickly in that sense.
Okay, and I think there is something really interesting around the fact that the first part of the game is competitive, then it becomes cooperative. How does that impact the victory condition for each of the scenario?
Yeah, so for sure on the competitive one, it's essentially an area control game where you are competing against other players to discover what the island brings in. And this is one interesting point because I introduced the endemic flora and fauna of the island in this part of the game, even though it's a picture of this certain animal that you may not know. But if you just search the name, you can see, okay, this is an endemic plant of Puerto Rico, and this is what it has. And of course, going through all that, you're going through the track that I mentioned earlier. So in the first game, the track is how much you're contributing to the island discovery, and also getting control of the island. So there's different win conditions in the competitive aspect of the game. In the cooperative ones, in the second one, it is interesting because there is only one main lose condition, which is if you lose the whole control of the island, then then you lose. But there's multiple ways to win because
Mm.
the objective cards, which are the historical goals, there it's a deck of 15 to 20 cards that you shuffle, and you draw 5 of them, and those are the 5 historical cards that correspond to each region for the whole game. So you may not even see historical components that happened during that time in your first playthrough. And so there's multiple ways to win essentially in that sense, right? And then the third one is the other way around. There's only one way to win, which is you're trying to escape the island because you've lost control of the island. So you're trying to open up holes to where you can escape the island by using your Taíno cards to do so. And once you get, you do 3 of each region, you win, but you lose in multiple ways, including, losing all the Taíno cards, losing complete control of the island by filling it up because there's it's not enough to catch up. You're just trying to survive at this point. And the farther you go through the track, the more actions that you lose. Because historically, they didn't have access to their canoes at some point because the Spanish started taking them away. So again, going on the historical mechanisms, right? Because I didn't want to incorporate just a paragraph of this is
Mm.
what happened, but I want you to experience that.
Okay, but that's really interesting. And I was wondering, so how like you're in development now? How are playtests going?
So as you know, we're currently on the P500 for GMT, and you've had one of these before. So for us, it's been essentially we're waiting on the P500 to finish, and then continue on with finishing the development and incorporating the final art and all that. Because as you know, the whole reason for the P500 being GMT wants to make sure that the game has the audience before they want to put all their time and resources into finishing the game.
Great. Thanks for this overview of the game. And while we're looking at the game and its mechanics, I think the question that comes to mind is what games inspired you in that design process?
Yeah, I mean, on the general side of board gaming, one for sure was pandemic,
Mm.
and the whole system of pandemic of the disease, right, and taking over the world, and that is one thing that definitely was uh, something that I definitely thought about when playing this game, and of course another one being Spirit Island, because Spirit
Yeah.
Island being more on the nose of, okay, this is you're the island and the spirits of the island, and going against these invaders, right? So this is obviously more on the nose of being a historical context and being more real, because even though you are the Taíno and you have gods, and the gods are actually in the Taíno deck, um, and because even though there, there's there that's the religious element, but that's who you represent, right? And that's why they're there. But it is more of a real story because of obviously the base of the historical context which it comes from. But yeah, those are definitely ones that were an inspiration in a sense. But a lot of times when with my designs, I try to not take inspiration from games because I want there's to be something fresh in this game and a lot. And one of the things on this one was essentially the transition of again having a competitive game, cooperative, and survival game all in one that use the same base mechanisms, because that's what historically the emotion was from the Taino people.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Good. But now that we've talked about the game and so a bit more about the mechanic, and thanks again for showing the prototype, I guess
Of course.
the final part of the discussion would be around, well, the history itself and your research process and how to integrate history into games in general. I'm gonna remove this and we're gonna go back to our very nice faces here. And so you gave us a bit of an historical overview of what you are representing in the game, and something that I had in the back of my mind, and that makes a lot of sense. And it's often a problem that we have when we're making historical board games is that, well, most of the history is written by the victor. So how did you approach finding material, research material to actually do your base research for that game?
Well, that is completely true, and it was hard. It was hard to find the research material to be able to do this game. But there was, if you look hard enough, you can definitely find it. And one of my base books that I used was this one, Agüeybana el Bravo. Agüeybana is essentially the High Cacique that I talked about earlier. And the author of this book, Jalil Sued, he is a historian from Puerto Rico, and one of the main things that I loved about his work in this is that instead of referencing existing historians, from the past, even the 1600s, 1700s, and so on, he went to the source material. Stuff like letters that were sent from the Spanish to their relatives in Spain, and even the archaeological components that are currently in the island. So he used the source material as his source for historical research, instead of using the subjective view of historians in the couple centuries after that, or even today. So having, of course, I'm not a historian, so I don't know what that whole process looks like. But having a person that did that work was definitely, a lot of work saved on my part. But so that meant that I went through a lot of his source material, and that was me. Instead of, like I said, I had a newborn at the time. Instead of designing games, watching TV, that was all I was doing, just reading the historical text. And and this is because I hadn't started designing the game yet, right?
Mm.
So what I decided to do was, as I read through the historical documents, okay, that's something that may be part of a game. I'm gonna add it, and I have this whole spreadsheet of hundreds of lines and dozens of columns that link the different where things are and where this should be and how I can use this in the game. And that's how the game came together, essentially, as I
Yeah.
was doing the research.
Because that was the follow-up question that I had, because based on what you did before and what you did now, it felt like it's two very different approaches. Like, it was not the mechanics coming first and just having a theme
Exactly.
that made sense. You actually started from the material, and I was wondering how much did it impact your design process, and it looks like it impacted quite extensively. So your first step was reading and trying to find ideas of mechanics and then putting everything together. How did it go?
Well, I definitely had a base in a
Mm.
sense, right? Because, obviously using the map of the island is something that I wanted to do, not just from a visual perspective, but also a historical perspective. Because the reason why the Spanish were there, introducing Christianity was one of them, right? But also, gold. and that being part of it, and how I could introduce that main component that was so important at the time, and frankly still is, right? And how that could be a source of conflict between the game. And of course, as I read and discovered where was this and when did it happen and how did it happen, is how that all came together. And essentially, my original design, I just had one huge game, right? I had a game of 7 chapters that you would go through. It would take 4 hours, and because that's what, okay, maybe this is what a historical game should be, something that's grandiose, and you could just get into it and experience this whole game in one sitting. But I also kind of wanted to bring my audience, right? The audience of more of a family game. And of course, I wanted the audience to be Puerto Ricans today, right? That they could play this game and not have this huge wall of complexity in front of it, and they could just, have them be pushed away because of that. So I wanted to have that nice in between, that it could incorporate, family play, and of course having learning in all of it, but through the gameplay and
Mm.
mechanisms, and not just through reading, but also be something that could be having depth enough and be interesting enough for other people in the wargaming genre.
But it's interesting what you're saying, because it's often something that historical designers struggle with, especially when they try to make games more accessible. This balance between accessibility and historical details. What rule of thumb did you use to decide? Okay, I keep this, I remove that. How did you approach this?
Well, for me, essentially, it definitely has to do with, is this something that I would play? Because I design games that I want to play. And when I have to, read at the start of my turn every single time, and I don't fault anybody for doing that. And if it is interesting, of course, it's something that I will definitely want to try. But if I have to relearn how the game plays every round, is something that definitely pushes me away from that kind of game. And of course, the more you play, that's not the case. But I definitely wanted something to be like, okay, I could learn it in 10 minutes, or 10 to 15 minutes. But also, if I'm going to incorporate more, it's just information that I'm bringing in, mechanisms that I'm bringing in, and I'm bringing a whole new game. So even though you're playing 3 different games, all of them have the same base. So you spend the 15 minutes learning that base, and then you maybe spend 5 more minutes learning about the specific type of scenario that we're playing.
Mm. So we're talking about complexity, but there is I guess, an even more sensitive topic. As you said, the story that you're depicting is a history of violence. So that's it can be pretty brutal. And there was a question from Gordo here. That is also a question that I had in mind. So I'm going to bring his question up. He was wondering about how brutal the story, the depiction that you're doing in the game gets, because the material is extremely violent. So, and you wanted to make also it accessible to families, but you cannot also wash that history. You have to show things for what they are. So how did you find that balance of depicting victimization and violence?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an abstraction to it. I didn't want it to be, on the restricted area of things being too visual, because you can definitely come put your point across through some abstraction. In this case, as you can see, having something as simple as a deck of cards running out, it may sound simple, but you just look at it. All these deck of cards are faces of people
Mm.
that are the Taíno, right? And when you don't have them anymore, you lose, and that tells you that they're gone. That kind of thing. It has an abstraction to a sense, but it has a deep understanding of what essentially happened. And just in the scenarios as well, it is interesting because the last scenario where you're trying to escape the island, the map is completely different, because the map starts off with the whole control of the island is Spanish, and that wasn't the case on earlier scenarios. So little things like that is something that people can just discover as they play, and just through that have a deeper understanding of it. And even, of course, we'll have more of a historical aspect on the rule book and how things came to be. And just the stuff like the encomienda system and slavery, that because, like I said, Puerto Ricans are Spanish, Taíno, and African as well. And those things are incorporated into the mechanism of the game. Releasing slaves is one of the things that you can do when you do one of your actions. When on the enemy deck, the plus and minus. And it's a good thing that you release the slaves, because now you are able to do more with their help, and they're supporting your cause here. So it is not something that's completely visual. It is abstracted in a sense, but that makes it so people are open to that interpretation and just seeing it on a clearer view because of it.
Yeah, that's really super interesting what you're saying, and I think it's not that abstract when you think about it. Like there is an abstraction, but I don't feel it's really abstract. Like you have a deck of faces running out; it's pretty clear what's happening. So I think it's interesting what you're saying. Um, I'm wondering for you, Julio, what would success look like for that project? What would make you feel like I've managed to do what I wanted to do with this game?
Well, to be completely honest, it would be that it would be used as a base point to teach Taino history in Puerto Rico. That is what I would like. I've definitely been pushing and teaching people about this game, and it is something that I know it's going to be published. And the P500 is almost at 300 pre-orders right now, and it's been over 2 months. And I know that a lot of games have taken much more to get there. But I essentially want this game to be used for educational purposes in Puerto Rico.
Well, that's a beautiful objective. But that was my last question, and I wanted to thank you again for taking the time and talking with me about your project. I think it's a really really interesting project, and I'm really happy to see different kinds of topics being covered in historical gaming. So that's really great. Before we leave, is there any last thing that you would like to say to the audience here? That has been really nice, asking really great questions. I wanted to thank everyone for being so engaging. Any last words, Julio, for the show,
Well,
obviously?
well, Fred. First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about Borikén and just talk about my personal involvement in this, because this obviously is a personal project, and having people like GMT be willing to take a step towards this kind of project is something that I'm very happy about. And anybody that's listening right now, if it is something that's remotely interesting to you, be sure to pre-order that game if you can, even if it's if it looks nice because the map looks so colorful. Then that's that's all I ask. So I do appreciate for everybody's support on the game, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'd be willing to talk about any of the of questions that you have regarding the game or just the process of designing it.
Great, but thanks. And maybe just to a quick note here, I added the link to the project, to the P500 pre-order page on the description. So if you want to check it out, you can go there. And I think supporting projects like this is super important. So go there and click on that link and back that project to make it happen. And I guess people can interact with you probably on BGG because you have a BGG page for that game. And I guess you answer a question over there, right?
Yeah, on VGG and Twitter. I'm at Hunasaru on Twitter. That's where I'm mostly show all my board game related stuff. So you can definitely tweet at me there, and I'll respond as soon as I see it.
Awesome. But thanks a lot, Julio. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. And no stream next week, but there will be another one in a week from now. And if you have listened to the podcast, you will know what it is. And if you haven't listened to the podcast, maybe that's what you should be doing right now. Go and listen to the podcast. So thanks everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great evening. And thanks again, Julio. And I hope to see you very soon.